Good morning. I'm proud to be here on unceded Algonquin territory and very proud to be with award-winning author John Vaillant, who's written perhaps one of the most frightening books I've ever read on the nature of the climate catastrophe that is unfolding. Yesterday, Suncor CEO Rich Kruger, a former vice president of Exxon, testified at Parliament. And the message that we got from Suncor is very clear. They have no intention of taking responsibility for the damage that they are doing to the planet and no intention of changing course, even as our planet is on fire. There are now hundreds of lawsuits against companies like Exxon in jurisdictions all over the United States and all over the world, and yet in Canada, it is business as usual. Trying to get answers from Mr. Kruger about what he and his fellow senior executives at Exxon knew, we couldn't get those answers. But the evidence is clear. In the 1980s, Exxon had the scientific evidence that they were causing, quote, catastrophic impacts to the planet. They suppressed that evidence and yet then spent millions creating false reports promoting the safety of fossil fuel burning. We know from the California indictment against the Big Five that Shell's scientists warned that by the time the impacts became known roughly around 2000, it might be too late for us to do anything. Shell suppressed that evidence, but in 1989, 1 year later, Shell raised their offshore oil rigs by 6 feet to be ready as the ice shelves melted and sea levels rose. They knew what they were doing and they lied. We tried to get answers from Mr. Kruger about Suncor's role in the massive lawsuit that's underway in Colorado, a lawsuit that has been called a blockbuster against big oil. Mr. Kruger didn't want to answer that. We tried to get answers from Mr. Kruger on what Suncor's position on the clean energy regs, and yet he hadn't seemed to have looked at them, even though he owns some of the biggest gas station empire in Canada. We need answers from these guys. They need to be accountable for what they're doing and what they did. But what we really heard from Suncor yesterday is that they are doubling down. They are going full bore, despite the calls of the International Energy Agency, despite the calls of the IPCC. They are going full bore. This is Canada's big tobacco moment, and our government, the Liberals, are missing in action. It's been 3 years since this government promised an emissions cap. Where is it? What steps will this government take to actually get serious about dealing with big oil and ensuring a clean energy transition as our planet is suffering unprecedented wildfires, flood, and environmental damage? I'll now turn it over to John Vaillant.
Hi, thanks. Yesterday was really instructive, spending time with Mr. Kruger and his fellows. I really felt like I was in the 1980s. In terms of the evolution of the message and the kind of business they still imagine themselves entitled to do. And the concessions they were making were, well, we'll burn some ethanol, we'll do some carbon capture, but these are all tiny little micro maneuverings in the face of a crisis. I mean, it's really like there's a tidal wave coming, and maybe I'll angle the boat a little bit this way. It's not enough. It's not adequate. And last summer, that is still burning, we're still in the black summer of Canada, is the most painful wake-up, that I think that this country has ever had as far as the climate crisis. That is not something in the future. It's not something that people in California or Australia suffer. It's ours now. It affects everybody. It affects our tourism. It affects our safety. It affects our mental health. And I honestly think, after the research I did on the Fort McMurray fire, we could have a new psychological designation in Canada, which is post-evacuation PTSD. These are scarring events for people. It wasn't just this summer, but in Fort McMurray too, where people started the day with the smoke plume on the horizon. By midday, they're running for their lives, and they literally don't know where the smoke ends, where the fire ends, or if they'll see their loved ones again. These are Canadians at home in peacetime experiencing these terrors. It's morally wrong, and it's directly linked to the expansion of fossil fuel development and the CO2 and methane that goes along with it. And again, this was documented and understood by the late 1960s. The API, the American Petroleum Institute, commissioned its own studies with its own petroleum company vetted scientists. And they confirmed this danger, and they pressed ahead, endangering all of us. And now the dissonance is so loud, and it's almost insane to be talking about fossil fuel development literally as provinces burn, to the point that the smoke and the heat is shutting down petroleum operations. Think about it. It doesn't make any sense. And it's not just, well, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense, and it can get us killed. Really. And it's not just a Western Canadian problem. We saw Halifax. I've been studying the climate file and Canadian fire for 7 years, and I was completely blindsided by Halifax. That's the land of sea and fog. And the idea that it could burn like Alberta, it's mind-blowing. But it's here now, and that's the one thing that the climate scientists got wrong. They got everything else right. The one thing they got wrong, in my view, is they underestimated the speed with which these changes would be upon us. And I think a lot of us thought, well, maybe it'll get hot enough for Halifax to burn, for Ottawa to burn, maybe in the 2030s or 2040s. It could happen next summer. And we have to act that way, and we have to demand an acknowledgement and an appropriate response from the petroleum industries that do business in our country. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Richard Cannings. I'm the NDP critic for emergency preparedness and climate adaptation. And I just want to follow on to what Charlie and John have said. We are living the effects of climate change that is caused by burning fossil fuels. And we are going to be living those effects for centuries. These effects won't stop when we stop emitting carbon dioxide. They will go on. We are fighting to reduce our emissions so that it doesn't get too much worse. And yet we are living those effects now, and it is affecting all Canadians. 8 firefighters lost their lives this summer. Hundreds of people lost their homes. Thousands of people were evacuated from their homes. As John mentioned, a very, very traumatic event for those people. There's an article in the Globe and Mail today, 60% of Canadian businesses say they were adversely affected by extreme weather events. I come from the Okanagan Valley. Hundreds of people have told me the effects that it has on them, on their business, when tourists don't come, when people can't even leave their homes. It's affecting everybody. People can't sell their homes now in the Okanagan Valley in summer because you can't get house insurance if there's a fire burning within 100 kilometers of your home. If you can get house insurance, those insurance prices are going up. It's affecting everybody, and it's affecting the governments across Canada. I'm trying to propose to the federal government that they create a national wildfire fighting service because it's clear we're overwhelmed. British Columbia brought in more than 2,000 firefighters from other jurisdictions, mainly from other countries. British Columbia spent more than $700 million this summer alone on fighting fires. That doesn't include all the other economic impacts from those events. It's affecting all of us, and we have to get the federal government to take action, to take some accountability, and for the fossil fuel industry to take some accountability. And I'd like to pass it on to Mike Morrice to finish up here.
Well, thank you, Richard. Thank you all for being here this morning. It's an honor to be here with colleagues as well as John. We have experts and parliamentarians coming together to say that enough is enough, that the climate crisis is not on our doorstep, it is here. Wildfires this year alone, over 175,000 square kilometers burned across the country, more than double the previous year back in 1995. And we know that in the midst of all this, not only does the federal government continue to subsidize the very sector most responsible for the crisis we are in, but that same industry, that big oil, continues to profiteer on the backs of Canadians. Last year alone, the profits of the 5 largest oil and gas companies in this country was $36 billion. Some will talk about a rising carbon tax. A carbon tax is the most efficient climate policy in this country. It rose 2 cents last year. Meanwhile, the profits of the oil and gas industry went up 18 cents a litre. While doing that, our country continues to burn. At the very least, we should be seeing an excess profit tax applied on the oil and gas industry. I'm proud to have colleagues here who are joining us in this. At the very least, to say, let's do with big oil what this federal government has done with life insurance and banks already. If we were serious about this crisis, we would go much further, end the subsidies, invest in proven climate solutions. With that, I'll pass it back to John for questions that you all might have, and all 4 of us are available for those. Thanks again for being with us here.
Questions?
The Supreme Court last week decided or said that the Impact Assessment Act or parts of it are not constitutional, and it seems like they're going to have to be rewritten. What impact do you think that's going to have on things like the oil and gas cap? Do you think it's going to make it even harder to impose such a cap?
I'm going to defer to Charlie on that one, or Mike, or Dick.
I think what's concerning is we've heard crickets from Minister Guilbeault since the Supreme Court decision. We need real clarity. We need clarity for those who are deeply concerned about the climate crisis. We need clarity for people who are looking to invest in Canada, particularly clean energy investors. So in terms of the emissions cap, my understanding and my reading from it is that this government still has the power to move on the emissions cap, but I've seen no steps to actually make that happen. So we're calling on Minister Guilbeault to tell us, what are you actually going to do right now to respond to the Supreme Court, and also to respond to the message that we heard very clearly: the big oil is doubling down and they're going full out on increasing production.
If the federal government is now limited in what it can do in terms of environmental reviews for expanded projects, what impact is that going to have on trying to reduce emissions from oil and gas production?
Well, the government has many tools. They have subsidized the TMX pipeline to the tune of $30 billion. They are going to subsidize the tolls of every barrel of bitumen that goes down that pipeline to the tune of 80%. Are they going to put that on the table with big oil and say, listen, you want to use our pipeline, you show that you're going to be reducing emissions and production? They could do that. They apparently, as far as I read the Supreme Court, they still have the power on emissions cap. Are they going to bring that in, or are they going to continue to dilly-daddle? The Prime Minister made those promises at COP26 and came back and we've seen no action. This Liberal government needs to say where they're going to stand. We see jurisdictions around the world taking on big oil, and here it's business as usual.
So can we understand from your answer that that you haven't had conversations with Mr. Guilbeault or Mr. Wilkinson about what the NDP would like to see in a revised Impact Assessment Act?
They have not reached out to us. This is on them to actually speak to the opposition, but also speak to Canadians. This is a serious issue. Canadians want action on the climate crisis, and the message we got before the Supreme Court decision from the likes of Suncor and Big Oil was that they were going ahead full bore. They were doubling down. The International Energy Agency has warned governments around the world not to invest. They said that the end of big oil is on the horizon and that we're going to be stuck with stranded assets, and yet we haven't seen any steps by this government to actually hold them to account for the increasing production that's going on that is destabilizing our climate.
Any more questions in the room? If there's no questions,
I'll ask one
okay,
more.
go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Kruger was kind of adamant yesterday that his remarks were misinterpreted, and he kind of tried to reaffirm your guys that his company is indeed committed to being part of the long-term solution to climate change. Obviously, you don't believe him. Can you elaborate on that?
He told his investors that there was a sense of urgency in big oil in the summer that Canada burned. He said that they didn't want to be seen just investing in environment because, to look sensitive. And that he felt that there was an overrepresentation. This is what he told his investors. There was an overrepresentation on the long-term transition, and that wasn't, his focus was on what was good for his shareholders. Now, I'm sorry, after summer of what we went through, I say to hell with his shareholders. What about Canadians?
Can I ask Mr. Vaillant one question as well, if you have time? There was an article a few weeks ago in The Atlantic that kind of made the case that we have now entered a new era, and they called it the pyrocene, that these wildfires are not anymore the exception, but they're in fact the norm. And I'm just wondering, A, if you agree with that, and B, does that mean, are we too late to kind of see any progress in the right direction? Is the toothpaste already out of the tube, so to speak?
So, the pyrocene was a term coined by Stephen Pine, just a wildfire historian and expert from ASU in Arizona. I call it 21st century fire. It burns differently because, in part because the petroleum company's own climate research and prediction anticipated that fires would burn differently starting around 2000. And they certainly have, and there's abundant evidence in my book to that effect. Exxon, in fact, had the temerity, really, after doing cutting-edge research in the 70s and 80s, to publish an article, to be quoted in an article about 2 or 3 weeks ago. I can get you the citation where they're saying, oh, now it's too late. And it's not too late. There is heat and fire and drought baked into our futures now, but to pour literally more gas on the flames in the face of that is frankly suicidal, and it's not rational. So there is, and my uncle is an internist, and he dealt with a lot of smokers, especially back in the 70s and 80s. And he said it is never too late to stop smoking, that lungs up to the very end can begin to regenerate or at least stop collapsing if you stop assaulting them. And so if we stop pumping vast quantities of CO2 and methane into the air, as we are doing now, we are going to see gradually a decline and a return to stability. It's going to be a new stability. It's not going to be 1970s stability, but stability is a lot better than what we're seeing now, which is a steady and relentless ratcheting up of broken heat records, broken sea surface temperature records, and species die-off. So the sooner we can stop, we needed to reduce yesterday. Many countries are reducing. There's actually a lot of action around the world right now. Canada, unfortunately, is a laggard. In terms of climate action, it rates down next to Russia. And that's mostly due to the bitumen industry in Alberta. It really skews. We're a G7 country. We're a modern country. We're a progressive country. We should be leaders, and we have the opportunity to be leaders. We are very well poised to embrace and profit from the green energy transition. There is no country richer than Canada in terms of its multifarious ways to generate renewable energy. We have 3 oceans of tides to draw from. We have infinite sun and wind and geothermal. And you have the Premier of Alberta stifling investment in renewables from Texas, who is a historical partner in their energy development. I mean, that's really biting the hand that feeds you. That is bad business. It's bad relations. It doesn't make any sense.
Can I just briefly add? We are living in what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us is the closing window of opportunity. And so any talk of it's too late or interjurisdictional issues are too difficult are simply insufficient. I think the reality is for each of us can we look our kids and grandkids in the eye that in this closing window of opportunity, we did everything possible to ensure we held the climate crisis in check, and that means ensuring that big oil is reined in, and that we ensure we step up at this critical moment. And that's what I think you're seeing from folks on this stage this morning. And ultimately, what we are collectively pushing for is the political will that this crisis demands.
So if there's no other questions in the room, I'm just going to ask the participants on the Zoom if they have a question. Please raise your hand. I'll give it a few seconds. Looks like no more questions, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.